Hello, I'm Dominic Shales, publisher of Climate Solutions News. Carbon dioxide removal is one of the more contested areas in climate technology. The science has accelerated, but real impact is still low, and it requires substantial deployment with a large amount of funding and political tailwinds, although these do seem to be coming. There are many forms of CO2 removal. Enhanced rock weathering, ERW, stands at a particular crossroads in the story. It's a process the Earth has been running for hundreds of millions of years, pulling CO2 from the atmosphere by letting rainwater react with silicate rock. And what a small number of companies are now attempting is to accelerate that process at scale, grinding the rock, spreading it on farmland, and turning a geological timescale into a commercial one. Carbon's one of the most advanced operators in the space. Founded in 2022 and based in the UK, it spread more than 313,000 tonnes of silicate rock across farms in Scotland and Ontario, Canada. This aims to achieve the permanent removal of roughly 69,000 tonnes of CO2. In April 2025, it became one of 4 global winners of the $100 million XPRIZE carbon removal competition, and its buyers include Microsoft, Barclays, British Airways, and McLaren Racing, to name just a few. But the story of how a climate tech business grows and delivers impact is also a story of how it's financed and operated. And the person at Undo responsible for that is Alex Berry, Head of Finance. Alex, welcome. It's great to have you here.
Thank you so much.
Can we kick off? I know you are a finance person, not a chemist, but could you just kick us off with explaining what enhanced rock weathering is, what does Undo actually do, and how does the carbon removal process happen?
Absolutely. Silicate rocks are one of the most abundant types of minerals on the Earth's surface, and they're part of the inorganic carbon cycle, which means that as they're exposed to rain, which is a mild form of carbonic acid, the weathering reaction takes place. You'll remember from school geography, no doubt. Carbon is transferred from being in the air via dissolution into rainwater, a geochemical process, into a carbonate form where ultimately it ends up in the soil and eventually in the ocean. So as you've quite rightly said, Dominic, it's a natural process. It's happening all the time around us, and we're leveraging that natural process to remove excess carbon from the atmosphere.
And did I get it right that you're working both in the UK and Canada? Are those the two locations you've chosen to start with?
That's correct. So in the UK, most people will have heard of basalt rock, which is very prevalent in parts of the world. And in Canada, we're working with a mineral called wollastonite, which is part of the same family, but has slightly different properties.
Good. And how does the choice of feedstock actually affect the rate of carbon removal, and then coming to your specialist topic, the economics?
Yeah. So, as you might expect, different mineralogical makeups react differently with rain as the process happens. Ultimately, the faster that the rock weathers, the better. It means we can generate those carbon credits more quickly. It means that the project can reach profitability, returning both credits to our customers who've bought them, but also repayments of any debt, etc. So clearly, faster weathering minerals are beneficial, certainly in the short term, whilst we're proving out this technology. We want to get to those proof points as quickly as possible. Basalt is a slower weathering rock, which is more challenging in the short term, but it is extremely prevalent around the world. So it's also really important that we use basalt longer term.
And from the farmer's perspective, what do they get out of it? Is the process good for the soil health? What does it do for crop yields? Those kind of things.
Absolutely. Yeah, so there are multiple benefits for both soil health. There is a alkalining effect. Some of your listeners might be familiar with the concept of liming, which is a very widespread agricultural practices. The application of lime to fields to offset the acidification caused by rain. And actually, you can replace some of that process by using silicate rocks. There are also benefits for nutrient uptake in plants. crop yield increases. We've got various studies running, both those sponsored by Undo, but also independent academic studies with different types of minerals, which are building an ever-growing data bank to demonstrate these benefits.
Great. And in terms of turning to the finance, which is so crucial, as I said at the beginning, these are typically, expensive programs that, need a lot of financial support to scale. Talk to us a little bit about kind of, the financing that you've had that is required for these types of projects to scale, and what are the bottlenecks or the opportunities to really get things moving?
Yeah, so the shape of financing is such that, as you can imagine, we have quite a lot of upfront OPEX costs. We need to buy the rock, move it, spread it on the land. And then the credits are generated over a period of years, depending on the speed at which the rock weathers, can be 10 to 15 years. And as those credits are delivered to customers, they pay for them. But clearly, there's a working capital gap there of numerous years between those two events. So solving that is a particular challenge of mine. Also, just to point out the obvious, but we're not building a CapEx item here. There are other CDR pathways that rely on CapEx, biochar machines, for example. You don't have that with ERW. So you have to be really creative with financing. Initially, there were offtakes in the space with upfront payment from very early stage buyers like Microsoft, for example, who would fund that OPEX. But as you might expect, we're increasingly seeing a shift towards payment only on delivery of credits. So using debt to finance the gap is completely critical. We signed a debt structure with the Inlandsis Fund last year, who are a Canadian climate fund. That was in relation to a new Microsoft offtake. So the coupling of the offtake with the debt to fund the OPEX associated, which was a first of a kind. Really, really exciting proof of concept. But what I would like to see in the future is move to a much more scalable, modular debt structure, which isn't so intrinsically linked to an offtake. We need to see a much bigger market-wide approach to the debt.
And do you think that's realistic? Obviously, the debt givers are going to want to have security of repayment.
Yeah, I think so. As we start to see reduced delivery risk in the marketplace, ultimately this is all about proving that the operations that we're performing will result in carbon credits. And as we see delivery of verification events, delivery of credits to customers, once you can prove that this process works, right? Rock goes down, rock reacts a certain way, credits are delivered. It's a pretty simple model, which can scale extremely quickly and in all sorts of different places. So I really think that that it's possible, just needs a bit of innovation to get there.
Great. And tell us about carbon removal insurance, because that seems to be becoming a real product as well.
Yeah, so we've used it a couple of times, both in a debt kind of de-risking process and also on smaller offtakes where we can't use debt financing because the deal size, but we can de-risk any upfront payments from the offtaker. So it has multiple uses. It's been very catalytic to get some deals over the line, and I'm really grateful to our insurance partners for their innovation to get here. In the longer term, just like any maturing industry, it would be nice to rely less on insurance. Ultimately, we need the cost of credits to come down. That's going to facilitate an increase in demand. And I think that's just a symptom of a maturing market. So completely critical for catalytic deals, but hopefully less involvement as we go on.
And Farm Credit Canada made a strategic investment in Undo earlier this year, with a target to triple Canadian operations within the year. What does that mean to have an agricultural lender in the picture rather than a purely climate-focused one? Does it bring a different perspective? What are the learnings from that relationship?
Yeah, absolutely. So the farming community and our wider agricultural partnerships are obviously critical to the scaling of ERW. Our ability to access land, share the co-benefits that we've talked about in terms of soil health with the wider community is really important. But equally, trying to disrupt a very well-established industry is challenging, as you would expect. So the stamp of approval that comes with an investor like Farm Credit Canada, who, as you can imagine, did a huge amount of DD on both us and the ERW process, is a really great step forwards as we talk with our Ontario farming base, and that they very well recognise, and that's been a real boost. And it adds legitimacy to ERW as a parallel track. We can marry CDR and wider agricultural practices together in a really nice way.
Obviously, we've talked a lot about Canada. Do you think is the locus of the company kind of shifting towards an emphasis on Canada, or are you going to keep everything equally balanced between the UK and Canada, or indeed elsewhere?
So the reason that we've focused heavily on Canada recently is the mineral that we're applying there is called wollastonite, which is a very quick reacting mineral. That was quite intentional, allows us to reach those proof points that I talked about as quickly as possible, demonstrate proof of concept, and then move forwards from there. One of the many fantastic things about ERW is that it's hugely scalable. We're not building capex, as I mentioned. We're leveraging existing infrastructure, both in mining and in agriculture. You can do this almost anywhere where you can access the right feedstock and agricultural land. So we certainly have huge plans to do this all over the world. But an important part to note is that you really need a lot of local knowledge. And we see that the best way of scaling in other parts of the world will be through local partnerships who may be from a range of backgrounds. But that's a really exciting next step for Undo.
Very good. Can we move to some measurement and reporting? So the MRV, measurement, reporting and verification, remains one of the hardest issues in carbon removal generally, but also in ERW. What's your approach to that, and what is audit ready, as you term it, in terms of for looking at a lender or a buyer?
Yeah, there are a couple of really key points, I think, to try and understand the complexity here. So one is we're looking at measuring geochemical reactions in a very open system. You can imagine that soil is a really complicated place. You've got different crop types, different soil types, different pH ranges, and the geochemistry isn't going to be the same in all of them. So you're measuring a huge number of variables. In the longer term, from a cost down perspective, it's really important that we reduce the cost of MRV so that we can reduce the cost of the credits. And one way to do that is to rely on geochemical models. So take less in-field data, rely on models. Those models, of course, need to be validated by in-field data in order to make them auditable. So we're in a phase at the moment where we're doing a lot of in-field measurement, but in the longer run, there's absolutely a plan to reduce that and the associated cost. In terms of audit ready, I mean, there are several verification bodies with constantly evolving methodologies, which are learning from all of these in-field experiences, both at Undo and our fellow ERW developers. So the methodologies are changing. They're reflecting all the learnings that we're having in the field from a very practical perspective, the challenge of taking measurements when it's frozen, when it's too wet, it's too dry, and all the rest of it, and learning about all of these variables as we piece them together. So we do a huge amount of science. We're in constant contact with the registries as those methodologies evolve. But there's also a lot of scrutiny in the sector on the data that's produced. And I would say, for now, the registries are being extremely cautious. We're all aware that we want to produce high quality credits that are backed by significant data sets, it's not beneficial to anybody to push through credits that don't have sufficient data whilst we prove out the technology.
I mentioned the XPRIZE at the top. Congratulations on that. That must have been amazing. During that process, you verified, and forgive me if I get the numbers wrong, but 1,209 tons of CO2 removal. So that was independently verified by two bodies to go through the prize application. How exactly did that verification work? Just to and how's that going to evolve as the volumes grow? Because it is, the process you've talked about is quite complex.
Yes. So the short version of the story is there's a lot of those in-field measurement points collecting data across the physical soil and what's happening there, the water within the soil, understanding the mineralogy of the feedstock, the rock that we've applied, looking at the climate conditions. And all of those data points come together to calculate the amount of carbon removed. As in terms of how that evolves, our approach is really to monitor intensively a fixed number of measurement sites, which span all the variables that we've talked about. They capture a range of pHs, soil types, etc., and use that data to extrapolate across our operational area so that we're not taking incrementally more measurements as we scale the operation. And that's an approach that is factored into the new isometric methodology for ERW, which is fantastic. That's the kind of direction that we need to be going to scale this.
And sticking with the XPRIZE, you were valiant runners-up. Didn't win the $50 million overall grand prize, which was won by Mati Carbon, and they were deploying, well, they are deploying enhanced weathering at large scale in India. How do you feel about the market overall? Does it benefit from having many players, or is the capital and the opportunity kind of spreading too thinly already?
I think, whilst we didn't win the top prize, having two ERW companies in the top four in the CDR competition is a huge endorsement of ERW as a technology. There's a huge amount to learn about ERW. It's a very technical process. We've talked about some of the data that we need to collect for these geochemical models, etc. And to that, and there's also a lot of local nuance. Operating in India is obviously very different to operating in Canada. So we're all busy learning and on slightly different journeys. And I think for now, to get ERW to scale, that's absolutely the way it should be. I think, Undo's been doing this for 4 years now, and it will be difficult for any new players to come into the space because of that bank of knowledge that we've accumulated along the way. But the opportunity there is that, as I mentioned, working with local partners, I see a huge opportunity for working in partnership with local feet on the ground type partners, leveraging Undo's experience thus far. So I think that's probably the shape that the market will take. But in terms of the XPRIZE, as I say, great exposure for ERW having two of us in there.
And a great achievement to get to that position, really. In terms of the buyers, I gave the names of some of them: Microsoft, Barclays, British Airways. They're some of the most credible, I suppose, in the voluntary carbon market. What does it actually take to bring a buyer like Barclays in for its first ever carbon removal deal, and what do you think that signals to the broader market?
Obviously, relationship building is a critical part of these deals getting done. They take a lot of time. They take a huge amount of trust, a lot of DD, site visits, meeting across the team. So a lot of work goes into them. Barclays is a really interesting one. As you say, we were their first carbon removal deal. They're looking to have outsized impact. helping to fund critical development, being a first mover in the space, but also they're quite somewhat risk averse in that space. They're quite different to a Microsoft type buyer, who's been doing this for a longer period of time and has a slightly different risk appetite. So very challenging, but I think balancing all of those factors, building a really trusted partnership, being there to support their narrative in terms of first mover in the space, but also getting them comfortable that we know what we're doing. Is how it worked in the end. And clearly momentum is important. Microsoft layering on top of that our British Airways deal, layering on that the Barclays deal. It's all part of the journey, and it's fantastic work on our kind of marketing and commercial teams to build that trust in the Undo brand.
Your overall ambition is to remove 1 billion tons of CO2. What are the 2 or 3 things that you need for that to actually happen, and what's the biggest risk that you see for Undo moving forward?
Pretty obvious that demand is the most important thing for us and across the CDR space. CDR is a critical part of net zero around the world. I think there's broad appreciation of that fact. Quite right that it should come secondarily to emissions reductions, but we've also got to face into the need for CDR now so that we can scale these technologies to a point where we need them. We're seeing a move on from the early stage buyers like Microsoft, who have done incredible work to get the sector to where it is now, but we now need to see other buyers in the space step up. So hopefully we'll see more and more of those offtake deals coming through.
And given the shifts in the political climate, particularly in the US, do you see risk in that? Are people, drawing back from these type of contracts?
Yeah, I think obviously things are challenging in the US, but that's offset with some really positive news in the EU and Japan. We can see a path there towards convergence of the voluntary market with the compliance market, which will be fantastic. So yes, undoubtedly there are some headwinds, but also opportunities in other places. And a lot of it comes down to public appetite as well, right? We would like to see more and more companies commit to net zero and make serious plans to get there. And we as the public have a role to play in that.
Great. So Alex Barry from Undo, thank you very much indeed. And what comes through in the conversation for me is that gap between scientific proof and commercial scale isn't really just a question of chemistry, because you're proving it works, the weathering works. It's whether the financial infrastructure can develop quickly enough to carry it, whether the market is there, whether there's support from the regulatory bodies, etc. So just tell us where people can find out more about Undo.
Yes, so got a great website, which is un-do.com. Obviously, we're on lots of social media platforms as well, and we're lucky to have been mentioned in various press articles as well, which I'm sure you can find.
And if you want to check out more stories and interviews, please go to climatesolutions.news. In the meantime, thank you very much indeed to Alex Barry.
Thanks for having me.